I never saw it coming. One minute, I was planning our anniversary dinner, and the next, I walked into our living room to find him sitting there with a suitcase. His face was pale, his eyes filled with something I couldn't place. "I'm leaving you," he said, his voice cold. "I'm in love with Chloe, my assistant." My heart dropped as I stood there, speechless, frozen in disbelief. But then came the bombshell. "You've been holding me back. You're not enough." Those words, "you're not enough," pierced through me like a knife. As he walked out, I realized what he didn't know. While he thought he was the one walking away with everything, I was the one holding all the power, and I was about to make him regret this decision. Forever. I still remember the day Jake told me he was leaving. The words felt like a dagger to my chest, twisting painfully as they left his lips. "I'm sorry, Emma," he had said, his voice flat, devoid of any real emotion. "I'm leaving you. For Chloe. She's everything I need right now." I stood in our living room, frozen in place, as the words hung in the air. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. My hands trembled at my sides as I tried to process the weight of what was happening. "Jake, please," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We've been together for so long. How could you just throw it all away?" But he didn't look at me. He couldn't even meet my eyes. His gaze was focused on the floor, as if he couldn't bear the sight of me anymore. The woman I had once known, the woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin, was now nothing more than a burden. "I'm not throwing it all away, Emma. I just need something more. Chloe makes me feel alive. I thought you'd understand." His words cut through me like shards of glass, each one punctuating the realization that everything I thought I knew about our relationship was a lie. I took a step back, the pain nearly unbearable. But then the realization hit me. He didn't even see me anymore. All these years, I had given everything, my heart, my trust, my love, and he had simply moved on as if none of it mattered. And Chloe, his assistant? How could he? Chloe was young, driven, and ambitious. She had the look, the fresh, youthful energy that I once had when we first met. I had grown older, yes, but had that really been the reason? Had I become invisible to him to the point where his assistant was now the new prize to claim? "Is that all?" I asked, my voice breaking as I wiped a tear away. "Just because she's young and pretty, she's all you need?" Jake flinched, but he didn't say anything. His silence spoke volumes. The woman he had married, the one who had built their life together, was no longer worth the effort. In his eyes, I had become the past, the obstacle to his new happiness. "I'm sorry," he said again, though it felt hollow, like an echo of a man who was no longer there. "But this is what's best for both of us. You'll understand one day." I couldn't even look at him anymore. The man I had trusted, the man I had loved, was standing there, telling me that he was walking away, choosing her over me. His assistant. My heart shattered as he turned and walked out of the door, his suitcase in hand, and my world crumbled around me. I sank to the floor, my knees buckling beneath me. I had always believed that marriage was something you fought for, that love was something you worked on together. But in that moment, everything I had known about love, about us, seemed like a fairy tale that had never existed. The man I had married had walked out of my life for someone else, and I was left in the ruins, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. But beneath the anger, beneath the hurt, something began to stir inside me. Something deep down, beneath the pain, told me this wasn't the end for me. Maybe it was the end of my marriage. Maybe it was the end of the life I thought I had, but it wasn't the end of me. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to learn that the cards had always been in my hands. Jake just hadn't realized it. The days after Jake left felt like a blur. I wandered through the house which had once felt like home, but now felt like a prison. The walls, once filled with shared memories, now seemed cold and distant. I'd always taken care of the details, the bills, the home, the family vacations, the dinners, but suddenly it all felt meaningless. All the sacrifices I'd made, the long nights I stayed up worrying about our future, the countless compromises I made to support Jake's career, had led to this moment. But as the shock began to wear off, something else started to seep in, a slow burning anger that I couldn't quite shake. Jake had left me for Chloe, for a woman younger than me, more energetic, more ambitious. She had her life ahead of her. But me? I was just his wife, the one who had supported him, the one who had stayed by his side when it all seemed like too much. In his eyes, I had become the outdated model, something to be discarded for something newer, more appealing. I tried to find comfort in my routine, in the life I had built before Jake's exit. I threw myself into work, poured myself into everything that required no emotional investment. But no matter how much I focused on my career, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow lost my purpose. I'd been defined by him, by the life we had together, and now that was gone. But it didn't take long for me to start seeing things differently. Slowly, I started to notice things about myself I had never fully appreciated before. For years, I had been so consumed with making sure Jake's life was perfect that I had neglected to see my own potential. I had never fully embraced my own aspirations, my own dreams. Everything I had done for the both of us. His success, our home, the vacations, the dinners, the social events. But now, without him, I saw that all of those things could still exist without him in the picture. In fact, they could thrive. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't the one who had lost everything. He was. Jake had left, yes, but he had left with nothing but Chloe, someone who would, undoubtedly, eventually see through the facade he had built for himself. She wouldn't see the man I had seen. She wouldn't see the one who once promised me a future. She wouldn't see how much work I had put into building a life, a career, a future. But I saw it now. I saw the strength that had always been there beneath the surface. I had allowed myself to believe that I was worthless without him, that I was only valuable when I was supporting his dreams. But I realized I had dreams too, dreams that didn't need his approval or validation, dreams that were only mine to pursue. With every passing day, the sting of his betrayal became less about the hurt and more about the realization that I had been the one holding the cards all along. Jake thought he was the one making the decisions, thinking that he could just walk away and start fresh with someone else. But he hadn't realized that the life we had built together wasn't just because of him. It was because of me. It was my strength, my support, my sacrifices that had made everything work. And while he may have walked away, I was still standing. I was still here. I was done feeling like I was the one who had lost. I had been a partner in every sense of the word for years, but now I had the chance to be my own person, free from the expectations and demands that had come with being his wife. And that's when I decided to start taking back what was mine. Not just my dignity, but everything I had put on hold. I began to remember who I was before Jake, before the marriage, before the compromises. I had my own career, my own goals, my own worth. And if Jake didn't see that, then it was time for him to realize that I was better off without him. He had made a mistake. But he would soon realize it wasn't just me who had lost. He had too. The weeks that followed Jake's departure were filled with a strange kind of clarity. At first, I had no idea where to begin. Everything seemed so uncertain, so up in the air. But slowly, I began to plot my next move. I knew I couldn't just sit around and wallow in self-pity. I had spent so many years supporting someone else's dreams. It was finally time to build my own. I started with small steps. I updated my resume, something I hadn't needed to think about in years. I hadn't realized how much I'd put my own career on hold while helping Jake climb the corporate ladder. Now, it was my turn to rise. But even more than just a job, I began thinking about who I was beyond being Jake's wife. Who was Emma without him? What did I truly want? The answers came to me gradually. I had always dreamed of starting my own business, something that had been pushed aside whenever Jake's needs took center stage. It had always seemed impossible, with his demanding schedule and the strain of keeping up with his success. But now, with the weight of his absence, I saw an opportunity, a chance to finally put everything I had learned into practice. I could do this. I didn't just want to be successful in the sense of making money. I wanted to build something that represented me. I had always been someone who thrived when faced with challenges. Now I was staring at the biggest challenge of my life, rebuilding my life from the ground up and doing it on my own terms. The first step was getting my finances in order. I had been so focused on Jake's financial successes that I had lost sight of my own. I knew there were things I needed to handle: debts, investments, savings, and it was time to take full control of those decisions. I reached out to a financial advisor, someone I trusted, to help me make sense of the mess that had accumulated over the years. But beyond the practical steps, I had to confront something deeper. Jake's departure had shaken me to my core, but it also gave me the space to realize how much of myself I had buried in our marriage. I had allowed him to define my worth, to define my role. Now, for the first time in years, I was learning how to define myself. I started working with a life coach, someone who could help me unravel all the emotional knots I had been tied up in. I wanted to understand why I had let his betrayal hurt me so deeply, and more importantly, how I could free myself from that hurt. It wasn't just about moving on, it was about moving forward. As the weeks turned into months, I felt myself growing stronger, more confident. I was building something for myself, brick by brick, even if it was just a foundation for now. I wasn't just reacting to what had happened. I was taking control of my life, piece by piece. Every decision I made was mine, and mine alone. But there was still one thing that I hadn't confronted: Jake. He thought he had left me in ruins, that I would crumble without him, and I would be lying if I said I hadn't spent some sleepless nights wondering if he was right. But as time went on, I began to see his departure as a blessing. If he couldn't see my worth, then he didn't deserve to be a part of my future. I didn't need him to define me anymore. I didn't need his approval, his validation. I had my own life to live. And soon enough, he would realize that. But the most powerful thing I was learning was that I was in control. Not him, not Chloe, not anyone. The cards had always been in my hands. Jake just hadn't realized it yet. It had been months since Jake left, and although I had made tremendous progress, there were still days when I felt the sting of what had happened. I had become a version of myself I didn't recognize. Strong, confident, and independent, but still grappling with the emotional remnants of betrayal. However, I had made peace with the fact that moving forward would not always be a smooth journey. I was getting better at standing on my own 2 feet, but the path to healing was long, and I wasn't expecting it to happen overnight. It was a typical Wednesday morning when I ran into him. I had just finished a meeting with a potential investor for my new business, a project that had taken shape much quicker than I had ever anticipated. I was walking through the lobby of a building downtown when I saw him, Jake, standing by the elevator, looking just as polished as he always had. His suit was tailored perfectly, his hair styled exactly the way I remembered. He was the same man who had once made me feel like I was the center of his world. And yet, here he was, a stranger in front of me. He didn't see me at first. He was too busy talking to someone on his phone, likely about some new project or meeting, as he always had. I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to react. Part of me wanted to walk right past him, to continue my life without acknowledging the man who had broken my heart. But something inside me pushed me forward, toward the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated. He hung up the phone, finally noticing me standing a few feet away. The initial shock on his face was fleeting, quickly replaced by a forced smile. "Emma," he said, his voice warm but distant, as if we were strangers meeting after a long time apart. "I didn't expect to see you here." I tilted my head, searching his face for any trace of guilt or remorse. But all I saw was a man who thought the world still revolved around him, as if nothing had changed. "I'm sure you didn't," I replied, my tone calm but firm. It was strange, standing in front of him like this, not as his wife, but as someone who had long since moved on. I wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the way I had been. The hurt was still there, but it had been replaced by something else, understanding. Understanding that he wasn't the person I had once believed him to be. "I see you've moved on with Chloe," I said, the words feeling like a release, as if they no longer had any power over me. "I'm happy for you both." Jake's face tightened slightly at the mention of Chloe. "It's not what you think, Emma," he started, as if ready to explain his side of the story. But I wasn't interested in hearing his justification anymore. I had spent enough time trying to understand his reasons, his excuses, his perspective. The truth was, I didn't care. "I don't need an explanation, Jake," I said, cutting him off. "What's done is done. And you were right about one thing. We weren't meant to be. But that's okay, because I'm no longer defined by our marriage. I'm not the woman you left behind. I found my own path, and I'm walking it. Without you." His eyes searched mine, looking for a crack, some sign that I still wanted him or needed him. But there was nothing. I had moved on, and he wasn't part of that journey anymore. "I've been doing well, Jake," I continued, my voice steady. "I've built a life without you, one that's mine. And for the first time in years, I feel free." He opened his mouth to say something, but I stopped him with a raised hand. "I've made peace with everything. You may have left me, but in the process, you showed me that I'm capable of more than I ever thought. So I'm not bitter. I'm not angry. I'm just better off." Jake stood there, speechless. The silence between us grew, and for the first time in a long while, I realized that he didn't have the power to hurt me anymore. I had taken back control. "I should go," Jake said, his voice low, almost defeated. But before he turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something I hadn't expected: regret. It was only there for a moment, a flicker in his eyes, but it was enough. "Good luck, Jake," I said, my voice soft but resolute. "I hope things work out for you. But remember this: you may have walked away from me, but I was never the one who needed saving." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving him behind in the lobby, the man who thought he was the one holding all the cards. But in the end, I was the one who had been in control all along. In the days following my unexpected encounter with Jake, I found myself thinking about the life we had once shared. The past few months had been full of growth and transformation for me, but seeing him again, so unchanged in his self-assuredness, made me question everything. Was I truly free? Had I really moved on, or was I just trying to convince myself that I had? But then, I reminded myself, I was no longer bound to the past. Jake had been a part of my life, yes, but he was no longer my story. I had spent so much of our marriage living in his shadow, supporting his ambitions, and sacrificing my own dreams for the sake of our future together. I had done everything in my power to make our relationship work, but it wasn't enough. And that was something I needed to accept. The reality of my independence hit me fully. I no longer had to consider someone else's needs before my own. I no longer had to make decisions based on his career, his aspirations, or his desires. For the first time in years, I could make choices that were solely mine. The freedom felt strange, exhilarating, and a little overwhelming all at once. The business I had started was growing steadily. I was gaining clients, building relationships, and finally feeling the satisfaction of creating something that belonged entirely to me. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I doubted myself, but with each new step forward, I felt more certain that I had made the right decision to leave the past behind. I realized that the life I had been living with Jake had always been based on his terms, and now everything was unfolding on my terms. But even as I embraced my new life, I couldn't ignore the subtle undercurrent of sadness that lingered. I had given so much to our marriage, so much of myself, and it was hard to simply let go of that chapter of my life. I had loved Jake, and a part of me would always care for him, even though I knew that what we had was broken beyond repair. I had to accept that the love we shared was not enough to keep us together, no matter how hard I tried. Still, as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that I had gained something far more valuable than I had ever expected: a sense of self-worth. No longer was I defined by my role as his wife, as someone who was always in the background, supporting him, sacrificing for him. Now, I was defined by my own actions, my own decisions, and that was far more powerful than anything I had ever known. A few months after the encounter with Jake, I had settled into a rhythm. My business was doing well, and I was finding new ways to grow and expand. But despite my progress, there was still one thing I hadn't been able to shake: Chloe. She had always been the catalyst for the pain, the woman who had taken my husband away from me. And while I had begun to rebuild my life, the thought of her still stirred something inside me. But this was my journey now, not hers. I couldn't allow her to be the focal point of my story any longer. If Jake had chosen her, it was his decision, and it was time for me to stop letting her and him take up any more space in my mind. One evening, as I was preparing for an important business meeting, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw that it was from Sarah, my best friend, and one of the few people who had truly supported me through the darkest moments of my life. I picked up, and her voice immediately filled my ears. "Emma, you're not going to believe this," Sarah said, her tone a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Jake's been calling me. He wants to meet with you. He says it's urgent." I froze. Jake. After everything that had happened, after all the time we'd spent apart, now he wanted to talk? I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me: confusion, anger, and curiosity. What could he possibly want now? Was this just another attempt to make himself feel better, to salvage whatever image of himself he had left? Or was it something more? "I don't know what to do," Sarah continued. "He sounded like he really wanted to talk, like something had changed for him. He even said he was sorry for how everything went down." The word sorry hit me like a wave, a reminder of how easily he had dismissed me, how easily he had walked away, expecting me to just accept his departure without question. But could I really let him back into my life after everything? "I don't need him to say sorry," I replied quietly, though I was unsure even as I said the words. "I've already moved on. He made his choice, and now he has to live with it. I don't need anything from him anymore." But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was something I needed to hear for myself. Maybe Jake's apology wasn't about him getting back into my life. Maybe it was just about him finally understanding the depth of what he had lost. I wasn't sure what would happen if I saw him again, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to face whatever came next, with no expectations, just the desire to finally close that chapter for good. The next day, I agreed to meet him. The day arrived. I had agreed to meet Jake, though I wasn't sure why. Was it out of curiosity, a desire for closure, or perhaps to make sure I could finally rid myself of the emotional ties he had left in his wake? I walked into the cafe where we had agreed to meet, my heart pounding slightly in my chest. The old Emma, the one who had clung to the past, would have been terrified to see him again. But the new Emma, the one who had rebuilt her life from the ground up, felt something entirely different. She felt in control. I arrived first, seated at a small corner table. The coffee shop buzzed with the usual mix of chatter and clinking mugs, but to me, it was almost as though the world had quieted down, leaving only the space between me and the man who had once been everything to me. I checked the time, feeling a wave of emotion flood through me: anger, sadness, but most of all, relief. I wasn't here to beg for his approval, to plead for him to come back. I was here because I needed this moment to finally take control of the narrative of my own life. Jake walked in a few minutes later, looking almost too polished, as if he had spent hours making sure he looked perfect. His gaze immediately found mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by that same confident exterior, the one he had always worn like armor. He walked over and took a seat across from me, his movements smooth, calculated. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Emma," he said softly, the familiar warmth in his voice now tinged with something else, regret perhaps, or maybe it was just guilt. "I'm glad you agreed to meet." I studied him for a moment, wondering what had truly brought him here. Was this his way of trying to fix things, of patching up the cracks in his conscience? Or was it something more self-serving, a way to justify his decision to walk away? But no matter the reason, I wasn't here to cater to his emotions anymore. I was here for me. "I don't know why you're here, Jake," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But I think you've been avoiding the real question, the one you haven't asked yourself. Why did you think you could just leave? Why did you think this, us, wasn't worth fighting for?" His eyes shifted slightly, and for the first time in our conversation, he seemed unsure of what to say. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then tried once more. "I didn't. Look, Emma, I've made a lot of mistakes. I thought that leaving was what I needed to do. Chloe, she was just a distraction, I guess, a way to escape from everything. But I've realized now that I've lost something far bigger than I ever thought." I felt a strange mix of emotions at his words: anger, a small glimmer of validation, but most of all, something that resembled indifference. I had already moved past him, past his apologies, past the excuses. "Jake, I don't need you to tell me what you lost. I need you to understand that I was never just some part of your life that you could discard when it got hard. You don't get to walk back in now and expect things to be the same. You don't get to make me feel like I'm still worth something only because you finally figured out what you didn't want." I paused, letting my words sink in. The truth was clear to me now. I had spent years building his life, helping him, supporting him. And for what? To be tossed aside the moment he felt like something more exciting was on the horizon? No, I wouldn't allow that to be my story anymore. "I'm not angry anymore, Jake, but I need you to understand that I've built a life without you, and while I may have loved you once, I don't need your validation to be happy or successful. I'm already both." Jake's face fell as he took in what I said. His once easy confidence seemed to dissolve, and for a brief moment, I saw the man who had been unsure of everything. "I never meant to hurt you, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't see what I had until it was gone. I'm not angry, I repeated, though the words felt different this time. They were no longer just a statement of fact. They were a release, a final exhale from a place that had been holding on to him for far too long. I've forgiven you, but I need you to understand that it's too late. I've already moved on, and so should you. He nodded slowly, his face a mix of regret and understanding. I know, he said quietly, standing up from the table. I guess I was hoping I could change things, make it right, but I see now that I can't. You can't, I agreed, my voice calm. But that's not my problem anymore. As Jake turned and walked away, I sat there, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. I had finally closed that chapter once and for all. Jake was part of my past, but he was no longer part of my future. And with that realization came a sense of freedom I hadn't even known I was missing. Walking away from Jake that day felt like the final nail in the coffin of a life I had once thought I was destined to live. It wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about what he had or hadn't done, or whether he realized what he had lost. No, this was about me, and the life I was now fully in control of. It felt good to take those first steps forward, knowing that I had no one but myself to rely on. I didn't need to prove anything to him or to anyone else. The life I had created, the career I had started, the independence I had fought so hard to gain, it was all mine, and I had earned it. No one else had handed me this life on a silver platter. It had been built from the ground up, with countless hours of hard work, moments of doubt, and plenty of tears. But it was worth every second. I poured my energy into my business, making it thrive, expanding it in ways I hadn't thought possible just a few months ago. Clients started coming to me, recognizing the value I brought to the table, not because of who I had been married to, but because of what I could offer on my own. It was a validation I had never sought, but one that felt far more satisfying than any affirmation Jake could have given me. But as I focused on my future, I couldn't help but think of the women who had been through similar experiences. Women who had been told they weren't enough. Women who had been left behind. Women who had been made to feel like their worth was tied to someone else's choices. And it was for them, for all of us, that I pushed forward. I had done this for me, yes, but now it felt like I was doing it for all the women who had been made to feel invisible. Jake may have walked away thinking he had the power, but I had the one thing that truly mattered: control over my own future. And that was something no one could ever take away from me. It was several months later when I received a call from Sarah. She told me that Jake had reached out to her again, desperate for answers, for reconciliation, still hoping for a way to salvage something from the wreckage of our past. Part of me felt sorry for him, but I knew deep down that his attempts to fix things weren't about me. They were about his own guilt. Jake's life had taken unexpected turns. Chloe had left him, unable to reconcile the demands of his life with her own aspirations. His business had faltered, and he had found himself at the mercy of the very system he had once thought he could control. But none of that was my concern anymore. I realized then that Jake's story wasn't mine to fix. I had finally learned that my life was my responsibility, and I would no longer let his mistakes or regrets hold any power over me. I continued building my business, making meaningful connections, and living a life I had always dreamed of. My future was not defined by him or any of the things that had once held me back. A year later, I stood in my office, looking out over the city, reflecting on how far I had come. Jake had long since disappeared from my daily thoughts, and Chloe was a mere blip in the rearview mirror of my past. I had my own company, my own identity, and for the first time in years, I was truly at peace. Then, out of nowhere, Vanessa, Jake's sister, reached out. We hadn't spoken much over the years, but she had always been someone I respected. Her message was short. I see what you've built. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you." It was strange hearing that from her. For a moment, I wondered if she had heard about everything I had been through, or if she just saw the woman I had become, strong, independent, and confident. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I had learned a simple truth. My worth was never tied to anyone else. I had always held the cards, and now I was playing them on my terms. As the sun set over the skyline, I knew the journey was only just beginning, and this time it was mine to take.